Doug Wiley with Police Magazine here in St. Louis, Missouri at ILEDA 2022. This is Coffee with Police Experts. I'm with Duane Wolfe, a dear friend of mine, and an expert in many, many things, one of which is the OODA Loop. And you're instructing that this year again.
Yes.
And you've instructed it numerous times. I've been in that class a couple of times. Your title this year is The Scoop on the Loop.
Right. In the past, I've taken Boyd's concepts, his combat strategy, and put it into applications for empty hand. At one of the classes, one of my students was Luann Hamlin.
Oh.
And of course, whenever I have someone like Luann in my class, I always want to get their critique of what I did. And one of the things she said was, you know what, I wish you would have spent more time describing what the loop was. And I thought, well, okay, we'll put that on the edition because a lot of people have a limited understanding of what the OODA Loop is.
So go for it. Let's have it. What is the OODA Loop?
All right, so if you look at the loop, which is a circle which people most are common with, it's observe, orient, decide, and act. It's a concept that was created by John Boyd, who was a fighter pilot instructor for the U.S. Air Force. As a combat flight instructor, he came up with the idea, along with a bunch of other things that he did. One of the things we need to know about the loop is that Boyd hated that concept. It wasn't the concept that he originally started with. He would tell you, if people asked me, he said the loop was created so computers and generals could understand it. It had to be simplified. So what he preferred was the OODA cycle, which is a much more complicated, much more detailed structure. So in the loop, everything leads from one end to the other, where in the cycle, observation, action, decision, there's all feedback to each other. It's not a loop. So when I say that it's not a loop, it's an actual cycle. And then the key thing is if I were to ask you, looking at the loop, as to what one would be the most important, most people would say, well, it starts with observation, so observation must be the most important. And Boyd would tell you no.
Yeah.
It's orientation, because orientation affects everything, including observation.
Yeah, well, it's perspective.
Right.
You know, the adage that I use frequently in many, many venues in many respects is, you know, the two mountaineers, one on the east side and one on the west side of a valley. Each ascends to the parallel mountains, and they look down upon this beautiful valley, and one says, from the west side, look at that beautiful shadows running across from right to left. And the person on the east side of the valley says, well, it's a fantastic valley and wonderful shadows, but they actually run from left to right, when in fact it's really from south to north. And so your orientation is absolutely critical in all of these things. And you've said about the cycle, the OODA Loop being a cycle, and it's the fact that all these things are now interconnected in different ways. It actually forms more of a star. It forms an entirely unexpected shape within the loop, right?
Orientation is comprised of 5 things: new information, genetic heritage, previous experience, new information, and analysis and synthesis. So, and each one of those has a very critical component. When we take a look at orientation, you can break it down to the individual, you can break it down to the instructor, you can break it down to the person that you're dealing with as a police officer. And each is, of course, just like we are individual people, you have certain components where you're going to be individual. By the same token, as police officers, we have parts of that orientation which will be similar because of profession, because of our training, etc., etc. And depending on how deep you want to dive into it, the key components, and I talk about each one of them, one of the most important and most fascinating that I find is genetic heritage. That's where all of the science on how the human body and mind work together, work under stress, come into play as a trainer for me, because I've got to figure out what level of stress my officer is going to be at, what level they're expected to perform at. I've got to pick those things that will work best on that understanding. I've got to set them up cognitively and physically to perform to the best of their ability under that level of stress for whatever the task is. So understanding the science behind it and doing our very best to apply it every time we have that information in order to make our officers the best they can be is a critical component of all police training, and hence an important part of orientation.
Yeah, and you'll take that summary, if you will, of the OODA Loop and its application, and you can apply that to any and all types of police training, whether that be driving, defensive tactics in the mat room, verbal commands, command presence, obviously firearms and less lethal, and the entire spectrum of force. And so there's so many ways in which the OODA Loop can be integrated into law enforcement training across the board, but it has to be done in the correct way, right?
Right.
So you need to take exactly what you just said here, that the orientation is the most critical piece, and then all things flow from it. If you don't start with that, then a lot of maybe unintended consequences might.
As is always the case with training, we end up sometimes with unintended consequences from our training. So one of the things that I do with the instructors in the class is I literally have them take a task and break it down into specifically what is the observational skills you have to do for that task. And the analogy that I've been using for years is this: is every police officer in the United States is trained in Terry versus Ohio.
Yeah.
All right, so in order to have a reasonable suspicion, I have to believe that crime is about to be committed. In order to do a frisk, I have to believe that the same thing, plus that the person is armed and dangerous. And when I establish that, then I ask the class, how many of you have been trained on how to spot weapons? And in the vast majority of my classes, the majority of people have not had any training on how to observe a spot. And so do we have a lag, a missing piece in that training? The answer is yes. Well, then one of the things I do in my class is break it down. What are all of the observational things you have to do? And then are we actually teaching them? Are there things that we can do better to teach them in order to set our officers up for success? And we'll talk about things like the quiet eye. We talk about scan patterns, how experienced police officers look with their eyes literally differently than newer police officers based upon their training experience. Could we take that same scan pattern and try and teach it to the officers at a earlier stage in their career so they don't have to have the trials and tribulations of learning to look for those things versus and just giving those tools to them right off the bat. And again, anytime we talk about observation, we don't have the matrix ability where we take the cord and plug it in the back of the head so you're instantly up to where you need to be. You always need to have that previous experience, which is part of orientation. But if we can identify those things and put them into the training sooner rather than later, and having to have them learn from experience versus from training, then we can build that orientation in sooner.
Yeah. Duane, thank you very much for all this information, and thank you very much for your friendship, of course.
Of course.
And for taking some time.
Yes, I appreciate it.
Doug Wiley with Police Magazine. I hope you come back again real soon. We'll have more Coffee with Police Experts.